I looked up hundreds of newspapers about this convention and tried to paste in like a scrapbook what was claimed about this convention. What were the messages that were coming out of this convention? And some of these headlines are interesting because the message that the newspapers are reporting from this convention is that Rutherford was opposed to prohibition.
So they're not basically talking about the indictments in the proclamations. They're talking about the prohibitions.
Yeah, that's what the newspapers are reporting, is that Rutherford was against prohibition. It was a scheme of the devil.
Did he always feel the prohibition was a good thing or a bad thing?
I'm glad you asked that question. We'll get to that in just a moment. So most of the articles, when you look at them all, the majority of articles that reported this convention reported that Rutherford was against prohibition, that it was a scheme of the devil. And what about the proclamation? I didn't find very much about the proclamation in the papers, if at all.
They didn't take it as important as
Yeah.
as he did, and apparently, realistically, he could have said all he wanted about it. If they don't get it, you know.
It was an inflammatory message. Why would the newspapers want to publish that? So, of course, they published their own. They printed their own, hundreds of thousands of them, and distributed them around the world, right? But the newspapers aren't really reporting the message that they're pointing back to. But Rutherford was against prohibition. So, several more. Bible student president that says prohibition is a scheme of the devil himself. Bible student speaker opposes prohibition law. Same thing. Prohibition called scheme of the devil at Bible meeting. So that's the message that really was widely spread around. More prohibition articles. And by the way, Rutherford said it was okay to have a bobbed haircut, which was a new style at the time.
He liked it.
So that made the papers too. They decry prohibition, but they laud bobbed hair. Bible teachers hit prohibition and praise Bob. Prohibition decried, bobbed hair approved. The other real story that came out of this convention was that the Bible students weren't very good at following the rules. They were told if they were going to have the convention there, they weren't allowed to walk on the grass. They had to stay off the grass. Keep off the grass. Rutherford threatened to move the convention to Cedar Point instantly that week if they didn't stop pushing them on the grass issue. They apparently had a problem with that. But that's the other message that came out of that convention. That was all about the Columbus Convention. Eventually, they came to some kind of conclusion. So Rutherford is really starting to go strong against politics here. But remember, he doesn't take that neutral stance until 1939. And why 1939? Go check out our neutrality discussion for more on that. But how can the world be judged based on a couple of paragraphs? This is the lesson that's coming out of the convention, the Columbus Convention. And if it's a proclamation and the world's supposed to know the message, what are they going to get out of a paragraph or two?
God would have made sure the trumpet blast was in there and not keep off the grass. It only stands to reason. I mean, it sounds funny, but realistically, if God's hand was in all this, he would have made sure that the proclamation was in the newspaper, not just the Watchtower, the newspaper and all that. So
I like this headline here on the right. Bible students will hear 7 lectures today. I think 100 years ago, the guy who made that typo didn't expect that somebody would find that 100 years later, right?
Nice.
So some of the papers reported good news that Rutherford was preaching, but they weren't giving the whole idea of what he was stating, and that he was separating the sheep and the goats, and that he was making these denouncements. And of course, most of the ideas he taught then changed completely, but see our sheep and goats discussion for that on more on that. The New Era Enterprise has one article about it, basically, and a couple of talks. It doesn't have very much.
And if anything, that is the newspaper that would have enforced the proclamation.
Yeah. And they don't publish the proclamation, by the way. So that's interesting, too. Even their own paper didn't publish it. It was published because they were independent. So they published some things, and they
But
even had
something that
bonnets.
important,
Yeah.
that such a grand announcement that would have made it in there if they all thought it was that grand at the time.
They kept it. They were closely aligned with Watchtower, but they kept their independence because they're announcing through the 1920s about deaths of those who are no longer in Watchtower organizations. So they did keep their independence, and I suppose they thought it was a good idea not to publish the proclamation. It's just interesting why they didn't include it. But how did the Bible students of the time understand it? In one of the newspapers, just before the convention started, it says, "The convention will be purely a discussion of the Bible study and work of the association," an official declared, "and will not be debating ground for controversial subjects."
Wouldn't a proclamation and a trumpet blast be sort of that to the rest of the world?
Yeah. So because Rutherford already had this reputation of the words that were coming out of his mouth, I think they were concerned, and this statement had to be made. Well, we're going to stay away from controversial subjects. And yet, when the convention happened, they got right into the controversial subjects. And they drove around Columbus, Ohio, and gave 65,000 people a witness, door to door, giving that proclamation out and selling books. But yeah, I consider that controversial.
And if you want to, the viewers want to pause this slide and read "As Others See Us," that would be a good little indication of how the Bible students thought at that time.
Yeah. The Enterprise had a lot of these newspaper clippings that I was showing on the other screen, printed in the New Era Enterprise as like a chronicle of events. It's basically how the outside world was seeing them. And it's mentioned there, the keep off the grass there at the bottom. So that was listed in the Enterprise. Not in the Watchtower or the Awake, of course, but there's 6 points here, basically. One of them is the keep off the grass. It says that one of the papers quoted Rutherford about the Golden Jubilee, which means he was pointing to the following year of 1925 as being the end. The article states that his audience did not, it seemed, entirely follow him. Perhaps because more than half of the throng that listened were strangers to his doctrine. Guess that trumpet blast wasn't as clear as he thought it was going to be.
Or as loud. It didn't wake them up.
Says they didn't get it.
And that's odd that an outside agency would point that out and notice it.
So if it was to be a clear message as he spoke, as he claimed, it's a clear message, we're told here directly. They just didn't get it.
And if his followers didn't get it, how could you expect anyone outside to get it?
Neither one got it, I think.
So
the article continues, another point. They applauded the mention of the name Woodrow Wilson, while the speaker pictured the League of Nations as a scheme of Satan to ensnare men into a substitute for the kingdom of God. Yet, a few years before that, he applauded the League of Nations for their high ideals. See our neutrality discussion again for that one. The article also mentions a scathing denunciation of the clergy, which preached men into the trenches and stained the world with their blood, and the audience received it with silence. Silence. So admitting that all of the church leaders were not included in his target. So Rutherford didn't get the result he expected from the public, or his own Bible students. What he got was silence. So he tried to soften the message a bit by saying that admitting that all the church leaders were not included in his target. So Rutherford himself had to soften the message because he didn't get the reaction he was hoping for. I think he wanted applause and he got silence. Another point, there's also mention about Rutherford's advice to stay away from politics. Remember, that was a conscience matter at the time. See our discussion on neutrality. And another point, the Enterprise publishes one letter, about that convention. And so this is how the Bible student writing into the Enterprise, Bible student paper, understood that convention. And this Bible student says, it was a vivid illustration of the time which we know is so near, when the whole world of mankind will be seeking to know the Lord and his wonderful precepts.
The whole world of mankind.
The whole world of mankind. That wasn't what Rutherford was starting to preach then, especially with the separation of the sheep and the goats. But some of these Bible students still had this other view. And as we've seen, and Rood mentioned, they were hoping for reform. And they didn't find it. And the same thing happened in the 70s and 80s that Rood mentioned. So, very, very fascinating. So here are some more articles from the newspapers of the time. And it's about that missionary work that we mentioned, where they went out to all of the Columbus and the surrounding towns, and they were trying to proclaim this message and sell books. But if that was one of the main themes, the indictment, from that article, we saw the audience didn't get it. So how did the Bible students understand the message and the indictment? An advertisement was placed in one of these newspapers. In the upper right corner, F.O. Smith. That's a Bible student. And he's got the headline there, to advertise the kingdom of heaven is at hand and the presence of our Lord. So here's another Bible student and how he understood this message. And it says, in the case of the church, many are called to the regeneration offered during the gospel age, and few are chosen. The regeneration provided for the world, to restoration or restitution of the human nature in its perfection. Yet it was the previous convention and this one where Rutherford's judgmental message, where basically only the JWs would be saved, that's where he's starting. These trumpet blast conventions were the start of that. But again, here's an example where these Bible students at the time didn't get that message. They still understood that earlier message, or they just disagreed with it.
Or a combination of all.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. So it appears to be another one of those reasons, along with the 1925 failure, that brought about a 75% loss in the membership of the movement at that time. So it wasn't just the failure of the 25 date. It was the changing of these ideas, these ideas of hope that even those who don't agree with us will be saved, to becoming a message only we're going to be saved. This judgmental message.
And that would have been radical when your whole religious reason why you joined the Bible student movement in the first place is to help mankind. Everybody's going, and all of a sudden, well, wait, they're not going to, just us. A thinking person would sit back and said, hey, wait, that's a 180.
Yeah, I think that's why they lost so many.
So apparently 25% didn't think so.
Or they stuck it out for hope of reformation, right? So the first article on the left is again how the newspapers of the time understood the message. And it says, righteousness named as a cure. And the newspaper is saying, it is only by an appeal to reason and the teaching of righteousness that the desire of alcoholic drink may be overcome. So that's the message I got out of it, was the prohibition, and that's why the judge was against prohibition. And what does it say about the judge? Well, he claims, I'm not in favor of the use of liquor. That's not true.
Yeah, in the court dealing with Moyle,
Yeah,
it showed just otherwise.
and Salter, yeah. So those
Or
and those
Salter.
things he did during Prohibition, good grief, that was in both the Moyle and Salter trial. All right, so
You can't say that was a mistake. That's an outright lie.
yeah,
I mean, when you say, I
based
am
on what
not
we
in
know,
favor
yeah.
of the use of liquor.
The next article is a letter to the editor, and this is a Bible student, and he's trying to defend what was claimed about the convention, and so here's another example of what the Bible students at the time understood about the message. Did they see the message the same way Rutherford and the Watchtower is claiming just a few short
And
years later?
again, the Bible students were the Jehovah's Witnesses
Yeah,
that
yeah.
followed Rutherford. So it's when we say Bible students, we mean the Jehovah's Witnesses that followed Rutherford.
So in this letter to the editor, he's saying, I've been connected with the Bible students for more than 10 years. And really, he didn't really know that this was changing and going to change. But he's stating how long he's been around. Most of the Bible students he knew were total abstainers from alcohol.
So was Rutherford. He said, I am not in favor of the use of liquor.
But we know that wasn't true, right? We know that from court transcripts. Or he became an alcoholic later, but we know that wasn't true. That's documented. That's in the court cases that he lost. So Rutherford was advertising intemperance. He was advertising the use of alcohol. And you can also look at his booklet on prohibition that was published a few years later, and that booklet itself is another discussion for another time. It deserves a deep dive, but with Rutherford's own personal experiences with alcohol are well documented. There's no question about it. So, number 4, this Bible student says the war hysteria of 1917 to 18 was when the Bible students were subjected to public persecution of the most virulent type. So it's true that a lot of that went way too far. The Bible students were really persecuted. There's a lot of evidence for that, and we show some of that in our neutrality discussion. But why? A lot of that was because of Rutherford's policies and statements that were in the Finnish Mystery, right? That provoked a lot of the action against them. So when the heat got too hot for the judge, he caved in and took a softer approach. And he tried to appeal and appease the government, tried to compromise. Too late. It was too little, too late. So see our neutrality discussion, he ended up in prison anyway. And number 5, Rutherford denounced the peaceful proclamations of some of the clergy and denominations, while J.F. Myers praised it. So,
And you could see the same thing true today. Many of the witnesses don't agree with everything that comes from the governing body.
yeah.
They tolerate it, but they're like, well, I have my relationship with Jesus, or whatever. I've heard a lot of disagreements, especially with Armageddon and the disfellowshipping.
And they might say that, but they'll only say that in private. They won't say
Yeah.
it at the congregation. There's no checks and balances, right? So
See, back
whatever
then,
they
you could put
claim
it in
goes
writing,
because
and you
Yeah.
weren't going to be lambasted and to have everything taken from you.
So another thing that came out of this 1924 convention, the International Bible Students Leader sees the dawn of a new day in religious strife. And here, Rutherford talks about the Klan. So a statement Rutherford made at this convention, he says, I'm neither pro-Klan or pro-Catholic, nor am I against either. I believe in religious freedom and would never countenance interference with sincere belief. Why wouldn't he denounce the Klan and what they stood for?
And do they follow that today? I believe in religious freedom and would never countenance interference with sincere belief. Is that followed?
Not by the arguments and articles I see now. They would denounce such things.
And Yeah, I think you can say I'm neither. Some things you could say I'm neither hot nor cold, but you can't say I'm neither pro Klan or and you've got
Anti-Klan,
it
yeah.
in something like that. You have to take a stand.
If you haven't seen it already, check out our Miracle Wheat discussion for more connections with Watchtower and the Klan. Very, very fascinating stuff there. In the Golden Age, there was an article written about the Klan. In the New Era Enterprise for February 8th, 1921, Rutherford says, during World War I, the IBSA were badly treated in Oklahoma, but not by these countrymen. Some of them, after the lecture, asked Brother Benet what is the attitude of the IBSA towards the Ku Klux Klan. Brother Benet replied he didn't know much about the Ku Klux, but was watchfully waiting to see what the attitude of the Ku Klux is toward the IBSA, and that the Golden Age had recently published an article about that organization, which so pleased the officials of the Ku Klux Klan that they republished the Golden Age article in their own literature.
Now, this is something I did not know. This
Yeah,
is new to me. I've never heard this one.
and
This is good.
this is from the Golden Age article.
So the Klan. I've never heard this one. This is amazing, Jeff.
It's because Bonet was linked to this statement. It is just absolutely bizarre.
So the society has links to the KKK now. And no, they didn't endorse it. I'm just being humorous
No,
here.
They didn't endorse it because they say, quit trying to scare people with gowns, sheets, and hoods, but on the contrary, make a vigorous attack on the power causing the evil on our land and other lands. That is to say, big business, the controllers of the destinies of men and women generally, who exercise control and power in the most dastardly manner. The class that has wrought about the very things which you profess to rectify. They were against the Catholic Church, so that's the reason why they're mentioned in the Golden Age, basically, because they were very anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish later.
And you can't even hold Rutherford accountable for what the KKK chose to think was a good thing. They didn't endorse it. But it is humorous. I find it humorous, to say the least.
Even worse, in Canada, they had their own radio station in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. CHUK were the call symbols, and that's the radio station there, and some photos from inside the radio station. So here's a book, On Air Radio in Saskatchewan, by Wayne Schmalz. And in it says, Saskatoon's second station, run by the International Bible Students Association, opened in 1924. Basically, they tried to shut the radio down, and this is a little bit of the stories in this book, On Air Radio in Saskatchewan. In January 1927, the Saskatoon Board of Trade requested that the Bible student station be prohibited from preaching sermons over the airwaves except on Sunday. Yet this event was not important. A letter in the Saskatoon Daily Star showed that the Board of Trade did not support its subcommittee, and 10 numerous letters and petitions were signed by non-Bible students, indicated that the station's sermons were reasonably popular throughout Saskatchewan. So they were trying to shut down the station. Why? So in Penton's book, one of his first books, and this was written when he was still a Jehovah's Witness, and I've talked to him recently, and he said, this could stand a rewrite, because he was just trying to defend the society back at that time. And a lot of this also got incorporated into and updated in Apocalypse Delayed, which is not completely favorable to the society, of course, but it tries to be accurate to the history and the documentation. So in his book, Penton says, on January 7th, 1927, the radio director for the Department of Marine and Fisheries sent a memorandum to Alexander Johnston claiming that the radio station, Watchtower radio station, Chuck, was in trouble again. He went on to tell his superior about the Ku Klux Klan programs, which he stated had been investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and reported to the department by them. So basically, they were selling time to other people, and they were selling radio time to the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. And then the Ku Klux Klan broadcast their programs through Watchtower's radio stations.
This is all new to me. I never read or heard this. This is good. So it's basically like the neutrality. If we can make a buck, we don't care who we make or self to or for.
Yeah. And again, it's again that change of perspective of when do they Watchtower really become money makers? Here's a real good example of that. It's during that Rutherford regime, right?
Well, they perfected it in the Nazi regime after the
Yeah.
KKK. So
Yeah.
as we've shown, I thought it was all rumor. I
Mhm.
have heard that the society was a little tied to the KKK, but I never found any really documentations personally. So I assumed it was a rumor. But based on this, if they were selling radio time, that is an affiliation, whether you want to call it one or not.
Yeah. It's a ridiculous organization. It shows some of that racist background that I think Watchtower had. Not only were the racism of the Ku Klux Klan, but their very anti-Semitic statements they got into in following years. And you could see a little bit of that in our discussion, our neutrality discussion. Here's more on Bonet and his discussion on the Klan. And he claims to not know much about the Klan, but they were pretty quite well known at the time. So instead of denouncing them again, as would have been the best thing to do, he talks about areas of agreement they had, and he ends up they both hate the Catholic Church. He ends up agreeing with them on that. He ends up selling him a book by the end of this. So very sad connections with Watchtower history. But another odd statement by Rutherford at this convention. He says, "We don't have a membership roll. Times have changed. Now it's difficult to get off the membership roll because you're going to lose your family and your friends. It's all about the stats. It's all about the numbers, right?" And he says, "There are no dues, nor are there any high salary persons making money from it.
But the fringe benefits were excellent.
I got a mansion out of it and a couple
So
12
yes, maybe you
cylinder
didn't get
Cadillacs."
maybe you didn't get a salary, but when you're driving around in a couple of Cadillacs and a mansion during the Depression, I think you are receiving something, making money from it.
So, as I said earlier in the discussion, some of my Watchtower historian friends said that they don't really know much about the third trumpet blast. They don't focus on that one. They focus on the first and the second. With the evidence we presented in this discussion, I think the reason they probably don't focus on it is because of how much it's tied into the 1925 failure. And if it ties in 1925 as a failure, then isn't the trumpet a failure? And all of the other evidence that we presented for the things that were claimed that are no longer believed in that proclamation and in the statements that were made at that convention. And it can also be seen that the general public and the Bible students themselves didn't understand the message that Rutherford was presenting. Again, thank you, Paul. This has been another fascinating discussion. A very interesting deep dive into Watchtower's third trumpet blast.
And I think you and I learned things that we never knew before ourselves in reference to this one, more so than others. We always learn something, but this one seemed to be a little more than average for both of us.
It
So
was
thank
an
you, Jeff.
amazing find. Yeah, thank you so much. Please like and subscribe, and as always, keep reading. Thank you and good night.
All right.
Thank you again, Paul. This has been a very fascinating discussion. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave some comments. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. Get a whole story, not just from the Watchtower's perspective, but from all the various splinter groups. What were they saying? So until next time, keep reading.